In the past 15 years, there's a general sense that many public services have deteriorated. This is not just pessimism, but it's backed up by longer waiting lists, crumbling infrastructure, and even record numbers of potholes. But this fiscal black hole is likely to get worse before it gets better. The next government faces dealing with bankrupt local councils, falling tax revenues, unwinding of quantitative easing, an ageing population, and the fact that the most unpalatable spending cuts and tax rises have been deferred to after the election. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are some mitigating policies which we can look at. But however you sugarcoat the situation, the UK is in a pretty grim financial situation, and it'll make it very hard for the next government, whoever comes into power. The first factor is that future government spending plans are a bit of a mess. As Ben Zaranko of the IFS states, the government tendency is to announce pleasant things in the short term to be paid for by unpleasant things that conveniently fall after the election. For example, UK debt rules are being met by promising to raise petrol and income tax thresholds. After the election, the government is also committed to a strict spending limit, but without saying how it will be achieved. Some areas like health, defence and pension spending are protected, but that means that the other unprotected departments face real cuts of up to 13%. But these cuts would be on top of the austerity of the past decade or so. Since 2010, local government spending on culture, housing and planning have already been cut by 30%. The head of the OBR recently referred to the government spending plans as a fiscal fiction because there's no detail on how the government spending will be achieved. Also, when we talk about government spending, it's important to look at per capita spending. With a growing population, spending will have to rise in real terms just to maintain the same per capita level of spending and public services. Here you can see the contrast between GDP and GDP per capita in recent years. Now, whilst demand for government spending is rising sharply, some tax revenues are also falling away, going in the opposite direction. For example, fuel duty used to be a big source of government revenue, but its continued freezing means that its real value has been declining. But there's worse to come because the switch to electric cars means that future governments will lose this important source of tax revenue. The OBR state that by 2035 the government is likely to lose around 1.5% of GDP in tax revenue by the switch to electric cars. To put it into context, the loss of fuel duty will be equivalent to increasing the basic rate of income tax by 6 pence in the pound. That's a pretty big tax increase which you don't hear about. Now, if smoking is phased out, that would be another loss of a reliable source of tax revenue we tend to take for granted. Now, whilst it's easy to cut taxes and freeze fuel duty, it's very difficult politically to introduce new ones. Electronic road pricing is definitely an alternative, but good luck introducing that. It would be quite unpopular, as most new taxes are. There's certainly nothing left to privatise. In recent decades, the UK government coffers were swelled by privatisation receipts, but once you're sold, that's it, you've lost the income source. And if anything, we need to spend more on the privatised industries like water and railways, which have got into so much difficulties with high debt and underinvestment. Now, spending cuts does not necessarily mean lower government spending in the long term. Now, there's been real austerity in departments like police, local councils, justice and housing. But deep spending cuts can mean higher spending in the future. For example, potholes increase spending on car maintenance and increase insurance bills. Lack of doctors and healthcare can lead to longer waiting lists, poorer health, high sickness levels and falling labour participation, which leads to lower tax revenues and more demand for healthcare. The IFS also highlighted an interesting, you could say, false economy. To meet spending cuts, many police stations were closed to save money, but this led to a significant increase in crime and social problems in the surrounding area. The author of the study claims that for every £1 saved in spending cuts, the policy delivered an extra £3 to £7 borne by the rest of society. And the problem is that many public services have been underinvested for quite a long time, and we've seen underinvestment in roads, trains, the electric grid, all which will make it difficult to switch over to renewable energy. Another example of how spending cuts can increase government spending is in housing policy. In the 2010s, there was a real cut to public spending on houses, especially by local councils. Investment was reduced. And this contributed, there's certainly other factors as well, but this contributed to rising rents and increasing the cost of living. And this caused a rise in government spending on housing benefits. In fact, it reached £25 billion a few years ago. But the government felt this was too high, was spending too much on housing benefits. So housing benefit was frozen. However, for many households, especially with those with more than 2 children who saw cuts to child benefit, the benefit freezes during a period of high inflation meant they struggled to pay the rent. And as a result, the UK saw a rise in homelessness. The UK has one of the worst rates of homelessness in the OECD. But this itself is expensive. The local government council claim it costs councils at least £1.7 billion a year to provide temporary accommodation for those made homeless. So the original sin of cutting investment in building houses and social housing has incurred many costs to the wider economy, which increases the bill down the line for the government. So austerity can sometimes save money in the short term, but build up problems for the long term. And certainly in the next 5 or 10 years, the UK has a lot of problems which will need addressing. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, another long-term problem is that the UK population is ageing. The ONS forecast that the share of the population over 65 is forecast to rise to 32% by the end of the decade and then keep rising. Now, the government have already raised the retirement age to 66, and it's set to rise to 67 relatively soon. But nevertheless, pension spending has risen a lot and is forecast to keep growing. And it's basic economics that an ageing population will lead to higher spending on health and pensions, but you get lower tax revenue because less people are working. But it is worth bearing in mind that if we take an international comparison, the UK spends a much smaller share of GDP on pension spending than, say, France or Italy. So it's not necessarily the case that pensions are tremendously generous and we can cut them, because it would push quite a few low-income pensioners into poverty. There is an easy solution to the pension burden, you could say, and that's simply to raise the retirement age to, say, 70. And this would improve the fiscal situation quite significantly. Yet, it would be tricky for a few reasons. Firstly, there's been quite a significant divergence in healthy life expectancy, a regional divide. I think in Blackpool, the healthy life expectancy is 55, in Richmond-on-Thames, something like 70. What this means is that if you raise retirement age to 70, many people in certain regions and lower socioeconomic backgrounds will struggle to work until they're 70. Of course, another solution to an ageing population is immigration. The ONS forecasts actually assume zero net migration. I'm not sure why, because it doesn't seem very realistic. But anyway, migration of working age adults would go some way to improving the fiscal situation. Although the extent of that is uncertain, this graph from the FT shows the UK is actually quite good in getting a fiscal benefit of immigrants. A very different problem the government will face is that of quantitative easing being reversed. Back in 2009, the Bank of England created money to buy bonds. Now, initially, this made a profit for the bank and therefore the government. The Bank of England gained interest on the long-term bonds that it bought, but for a time paid no interest on the reserves it created. However, since the significant rise in short-term interest rates around 2022, the Bank of England has had to pay higher interest rates on these reserves that commercial banks have. The new Economics Foundation state that the Bank of England will need to pay £150 billion by 2028 so they can make payments to the banking sector on quantitative easing. But also there's another problem. As well as paying these reserves, the Bank of England bought bonds when yields were low and prices high, but now they're selling when interest rates are high and prices lower. Effectively, the bank bought high and is now selling at a loss. What this means is that in the years of austerity, government coffers were swelled by the profit from quantitative easing, but the next government will face some losses from reversing it. And this is a hidden burden on the next government. But as I promised, it's not all doom and gloom. There's no reason the central bank have to keep paying these quite high interest payments on all the reserves it created. Why should commercial banks get an effective taxpayer subsidy just because of the operation of monetary policy? The ECB recently moved to a tiered reserve system, which means you pay interest on a small section of the reserves, not all of them. And if the UK did the same, then there's a potential saving of 1.3 to 11 billion pounds a year from paying less interest on some of the reserves. Now, for all the talk of levelling up, the real story is that local government spending has been squeezed by central government cuts, and cuts to local spending really dwarf levelling up funds. And local government is one of those unprotected areas, and it faces even more cuts in the coming years. Now, despite many public services deteriorating to some extent, public investment as a share of GDP is still set to fall. Even the Labour plans to increase investment are fairly modest. In fact, investment levels will still fall as a share of GDP. And something interesting I learned recently was that public sector investment actually includes student loans that have been written off. And student loans really isn't public investment, it doesn't seem it to me. Anyway, the problem is that there are many candidates for public investment. Water faces a prospect of renationalisation, and there's a need for more investment in all manner of things from railways to roads and housing. Also, a final point worth bearing in mind is that the future debt forecasts are based on the assumption that productivity will rise to 1.5%. And this is actually relatively optimistic given the past track record of UK productivity. And if we see continued low growth in productivity, then that would be another factor leading to lower tax revenues and high demand for government spending. So the real solution to the UK's fiscal problem would be to somehow manage to increase the long-run trend rate of economic growth. But of course, it's much easier to say that than to actually deliver it. But without that growth, then the future governments are going to have a lot of difficult trade-offs. And these haven't really been presented to the population at large, because who wants to say we've got worse trade-off? But it does look like either higher taxes and or continued spending cuts, at least in certain departments. So it's not particularly optimistic from that look. But could we turn it around? Are there any more positive policies which would help increase growth? This video goes into some detail on potential policies that could turn the UK economy around.